You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Hey everybody, Brian McClanahan here. We're back with the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is episode 14, covering the week from February 15th through February 19th, 2016. Glad to be back. It's our Lincoln week, so we got a lot of good stuff to talk about. Every piece focused on Abraham Lincoln in one way or another this week, and so it should be a good time. One thing I want to mention to you, this is the last time you're probably going to hear this because our next episode, 15, will already be after our conference in Charleston, South Carolina has been held. So, Charleston, South Carolina, February 26th and 27th, the PC attack on the South. Come on out to our conference. You can register online still. We can take your registration till about Tuesday of this week. So we want you to come on out and see us and discuss the Southern tradition and this great monstrosity of this new assault on Southern culture and Southern heritage, and also what it means for the entire United States, what it means for Western civilization. So it should be a very good time. We'd love to see you out there. If you can't make the conference, consider a tax-deductible donation to the Abbeville Institute. We will take that, and it'll help keep things like this podcast going, the website, and all the other programs that we like to do. So please consider supporting the Institute in one way or another. We plan on having more events this year, and so these events will be happening probably at least another 2 times in 2016. So look forward to those, and also again, if you can please support the Institute, we would love to have your support, and we'd love to see you in Charleston. So let's talk about our Lincoln Week at the Abbeville Institute. We have 3 pieces by some of the great voices in the Southern tradition. One by Richard Weaver, one by Clyde Wilson, of course, always every week, and one by Mel Bradford. And so those 3 pieces were worthy of reading this week, if nothing else. But we also have a great speech made by one of the most unknown opponents of the Lincoln administration. Then I wrote a piece on Friday. So let's get started with the first. It's by Richard Weaver. It was actually published in National Review in 1958, when National Review actually had good stuff in the magazine. And the title of the piece is The Lincoln-Douglas Debates. And so what Weaver is doing here is very interesting. He's looking at these debates, which took place, of course, when Lincoln and Douglas were opposing each other in the senatorial contest of 1858, 100 years later, 1858, in Illinois. And so they made a series of debates, stumped all throughout Illinois, talking about their different principles, ideas, what they were going to do, what they weren't going to do, and of course these were generally attacks on each other. The interesting thing that Weaver does here is he talks about the way that these two people used language, the way Lincoln used language, and the way that Douglas used language. And it's basically their debating style that he says was the key point of difference between Lincoln and Douglas. It wasn't necessarily their positions, which, of course, there were differences. But he gets into this idea of, first and foremost, what were Lincoln's views on race? What were Douglas's views on race? How do they view black Americans in society? How would they fit? And how wouldn't they fit? And, of course, he brings up Lincoln's positions on race, which most people don't realize. The most laymen in America, if you were to walk around and you were to ask them who said this following statement, what I would most desire would be a separation of the white and black races, you would probably not have anyone guess Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln also said, I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and black races. There's a physical difference between the two, which in my judgment will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. Again, you wouldn't hear anyone say that, oh yeah, Abraham Lincoln said that. But you might say, well, it's some Southerner. You might say it's Alexander Stephens, or oh, that has to be some Klan member in the South. But it was Abraham Lincoln. And so he's bringing this out. Of course, everyone knows Douglas was hammering him on this. Well, Lincoln wants to bring about equality of the races, which Lincoln had to deny over and over again. And so he talks about the two things that they differed on, and of course the extension of slavery, which was a big issue. Lincoln trying to get rid of slavery in the territories. One thing he does bring up is that there was one issue, he said there was a potent one, because it involves, this is a Weaver quote, because it involves the idea of nationalization and the extent to which a state composed of many units could centralize its laws. And he goes on to say, despite his disclaimer, Lincoln never made a very convincing case for states' rights. Douglas, on the other hand, never sounded very convincing in his real or pretended moral indifference to slavery, which he expressed by saying that he did not care whether slavery was voted up or voted down. And Lincoln was a much better speaker, a much better person in the use of language than Douglas was. Weaver concludes, his conclusion is very interesting. When he talks about that centralization, one thing, Lincoln never he actually tried to make a case at one point, and I said he didn't, but he tried to make a case, he didn't do it very well. Weaver said he didn't do it very well. He tried to make a case where he actually had a quote, "It would be foolish for us to insist on having a cranberry law here in Illinois where we have no cranberries because they have a cranberry law in Indiana where they have cranberries." So, but he says it wasn't very, as I said before, wasn't very a good case against his view of nationalization, which ultimately happened with the Lincoln administration. But he basically concludes that if somebody had been able to oppose Lincoln in 1860, who was better at language than Stephen Douglas, we never would have had Abraham Lincoln. He probably never would have gotten even close to 40% that he got in the 1860 election. If someone like Patrick Henry or Daniel Webster had opposed Abraham Lincoln, something might have happened that was different. We might not have had, as Weaver says, our most mythogenic president. So it was the use of language that allowed Lincoln to be able to catapult into the national scene and ultimately become president. It's kind of the same thing that Bradford is going to say in his piece that we published on Thursday. So this is the key to understanding Lincoln. The way he used language and the effectiveness, the efficacy of his use of language that makes Lincoln so important. It's not his policies. It wasn't his policies that made Lincoln this saint, even though people liked some of his policies. It was the way that he could use language. We have to be very careful with that because if you look at the Lincoln defenders, this is what they focus on. It's how he framed debates. It's how he focused on issues in a way that the issues weren't even important because it's the way he used language. And so I'll get into that when we talk about Bradford. But our piece on Tuesday, it's a very long piece. It was a speech made by Senator James A. Byard, Jr., or the Younger of Delaware. Now, Byard is one of these people, as I said before, one of the most unknown but important of Lincoln's opponents during the war. Byard comes from a very old family that had a lot of influence in American politics. His father-in-law was Richard Bassett of Delaware, who was a signatory to the U.S. Constitution. His father, James A. Byard the Elder, cast the deciding vote in the 1800 election for Thomas Jefferson, was a Federalist, but an independent Federalist. And if you read his father's writings, he was very much against war in general, and he was very much a states' rights Federalist, even though he didn't want to see secession when Northerners were talking about it in 1800. And then his brother served in the Senate, Richard Byard. James Byard, of course, served in the Senate, and I'll talk about him a little more in a second. His son, Thomas Francis Byard, served in the Senate during Reconstruction and was opposed to everything the Republicans were doing. And then his grandson, Thomas Francis Byard, served in the Senate during the Wilson administration and was a states' rights Democrat. So you have this Byard family, and James A. Byard was a Democrat, became a Democrat actually during the Jackson period, but he was opposed to Andrew Jackson. So he wasn't very interested. His James Byard's mentor was Lewis McLean, who was Secretary of State at one point. But Byard was this very independent Democrat and an ardent constitutionalist. He actually wrote a little book on the Constitution back in the 1830s, and it's a very interesting little treatise. He wrote it as a textbook for the Constitution, and he talks about all kinds of things, including secession in the book, where he kind of denies that it's possible, but then, on the other hand, says it could happen. It's a very interesting little textbook. But here's Byard in 1861 making a speech entitled Executive Usurpation. It's a 14,000-word speech. And most of the speech is dedicated to Lincoln's abuse of habeas corpus. But some of the speech actually discusses his position on secession. Now, I happened to write my dissertation on James A. Bayard. And Bayard was a secessionist, privately. He never was publicly a secessionist. But privately, he was writing letters to his son saying that if Maryland was to go and Virginia was to go, then he wanted Delaware to secede from the Union as well. And he had a lot of Southern friends. He was friends with Judah P. Benjamin, with Jefferson Davis, because of his time in the Senate. And in fact, when Fort Sumter was fired upon in April of 1861, Bayard was in the South, visiting with his friends. And he wrote some very passionate letters at the time about how this was all the Republican Party's fault. And then when he got back to Delaware, there was a mob waiting for him. This happened a couple of times. His life was actually threatened several times, including right at the end of the war. At that point, he was an old man. He was born in 1799, so he was in his mid-60s. And in fact, he resigned from the Senate in 1864 because of Charles Sumner's ironclad oath. And so he made a lot of great speeches during the war against Republican policies, against the war. His son-in-law actually joined the Union Army, and he wrote this amazing letter, which of course was private, but he wrote this amazing letter to his son. His son was named Benoni Lockwood, where he said, look, what you're doing here, if you decide to go and fight, if you decide to join the army and go fight, you're engaging in the extermination of the Southern people. That's the only result that can happen. And he couldn't support something like that. And so he cautioned his son against joining the army. His son-in-law did it anyways. And so Bayard was very consistent in his view of the war. He was against it. And he was against it because he said the only result could be the extermination of the Southern people. So he makes a speech in 1861 after Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus. And that was the executive usurpation part. But he also, again, makes some interesting statements against the war. And he uses interesting examples. One of them is Edmund Burke, who opposed the American War for Independence, at least the British prosecution of the American War for Independence, because Burke saw it as a disaster. And Bayard says this, quote, "Sir, I am as deeply attached to the Union as any man who claims a seat in this body. I would have saved it in its integrity by conciliation and compromise. And it is my consolation that, in my past life, no word or act of mine ever encouraged a sectional feeling among my countrymen." And this is true. He was always interested in compromise with the South. And he points out that the same language that's being used in 1861 was the same language that was used in 1776 by the British to crush out the rebellion there. Now, he does say that if we let the states go, that we yield the right of secession. He says that's not true, because he says this isn't really secession, this is revolution. Now, I would disagree with him there. But essentially, the revolution was coming, and it wasn't going to be because the South was out. It's because the North was going to wage a revolution in transforming America. And Bayard pointed that out later in his career when he called these governments essentially akin to the same spirit that engulfed France during the French Revolution. But he really gets into this idea of habeas corpus and who has the power to suspend it. And in fact, that's what he most focuses on in this particular speech. And so he hones in on the Attorney General at the time, a man named Bates. And Bates had come out with an opinion where he said, obviously, the president can suspend habeas corpus. And Bayard said there's no way this could happen. That throughout all of English history, the king could never suspend habeas corpus. The executive could never suspend habeas corpus unilaterally. That could only be done by the Congress or the legislature. And he gives example after example about how this particular act, suspending habeas corpus, which is one of the most important of all civil liberties, which is why it's actually codified in the Constitution. We didn't wait around to have the Bill of Rights to codify habeas corpus. It's in the Constitution itself, in Article 1 of the Constitution, which he says clearly shows, very simply, that this is a congressional power, the power of the legislature, not the executive branch. But he says this was such an important right because it protects Americans from a despotic executive. That's why it was put. That's why it was there in England, because people were worried about what a king would do to your freedom, and so only the Parliament could suspend habeas corpus, not the king. And he gives you example after example of how this was the case. Beginning with the Magna Charta, essentially. And then, of course, how common law determined that only the Parliament could suspend habeas corpus. And, of course, he says if we do this, if we allow the president to suspend habeas corpus, it's going to create a situation where the president will never be checked in his power. He also brings up, of course, Louis XIV and things that Louis XIV did as king, which we don't really want to live in a government under Louis XIV. He says, quote, "Let me pass on the consideration of the dangers incident to such a claim of power in the executive, if admitted. Honorable senators on the other side may think little of affirming this claim now, but nations, as well as individuals, are governed by habits, and habits fetter both the nation and the individual quite as effectually, and render them as helpless as Gulliver. Presidents which strike at great and fundamental principles and violate the Constitution and the laws in times of high excitement may be established by the party in power today. Rely upon it, if they live somewhat longer in the progress of events, they will find that in the future they may become subject to the same dangers themselves to which now they are exposing all who are opposed to the policy and measures of this administration. The law is made not for the protection of those who hold power, but for the protection of those who stand opposed to existing power. And no country has a government of laws. No country is a free country unless the law will protect them. And in that consists the distinction between a republic or a limited monarchy as a government of laws and a mere government of will, which is a despotism, which of course is prescient because this is exactly what would happen. As Lincoln goes through and destroys the Constitution during his administration, he sets the groundwork for what people are going to do in the 20th century. And Lincoln's justification was best subduing the enemy. I'm going to do whatever I need to do to best subdue the enemy. Well, Bayard would point out this is very, very dangerous because, again, what will happen when he's out of power and the other side's in power and the Republicans are then going to whine about what the president is doing? And we can look at that in our own time. When George W. Bush was in office, Democrats whined incessantly about the executive abuse of the Bush administration. And then, of course, when their guy's in power, Barack Obama, who does the exact same thing, Republicans whine about executive abuse. This is the point I made in my 9 presidents who screwed up America and 4 who tried to save her. And when people have asked me about Lincoln, and that's my hero, Abraham Lincoln, how can you say this guy screwed up America? I use the exact same statement. Because Lincoln was abusing the Constitution, which opened the door for other people to abuse the Constitution. And that's the yardstick by which I measure the presidents in that particular book. Of course, people who listen to this podcast know very well about Lincoln, but most Americans think he's a saint, which is why we need a Lincoln Week, of course, at the Abbeville Institute. We need that to ensure that we have ammunition for going out there and attacking the Lincoln myth. And this speech is excellent at that. I mean, Bayard goes through all of history. He points out the War of 1812 when there was dissent in the North, yet habeas corpus was not suspended. Not one time. And the dissent in the North during the War of 1812 was worse in many ways than it was in 1861. Bayard makes a statement in wrapping up the speech: you cannot vest power legally by a resolution under the Constitution where the Constitution is not vested. You have no judicial authority so to decree, but you may, in the face of the Constitution, by bringing the legislature into accord with the executive and the assertion of an unconstitutional power, subvert the liberties of your country. Which is true. Congress essentially rubber stamped the move, but he's saying you can't legally do that. And he hoped at one point that someone would impeach Abraham Lincoln. Of course, Lincoln never lived long enough to be impeached, but it wasn't going to happen. So Bayard was pointing out that what Lincoln was doing here was a farce. And the end result of Abraham Lincoln was going to be a despot in the future. And so he's prescient. I mean, Bayard was pointing this out in 1861, that if we give this power to Lincoln, what you're going to do is destroy the Federal Republic. And Bayard made statements in other speeches. Look, we've already got the Union. We already have a government. We have the Union. Why can't we let the states, southern states, go? We still have our Union. This is also an interesting argument that people say, well, we had to preserve the Union. The Union was still preserved in 1861. It didn't have 7 states, but the Upper South was still in the Union. So what Union are we trying to preserve? Bayard was one of the more prescient senators, and then he actually served again in the early years of Reconstruction, and when he was in his 70s, and was very concerned about the things he saw happening. He died in the 1880s, and while his son was in the Senate. In fact, he died in 1880 itself. So it was interesting to write a long scholarly examination of Bayard's career, because he said some really important things in his letters and his speeches, things that we would look back on and say, well, yeah, I mean, this is important stuff. Things he was saying about the Constitution, things he was saying about the Union. And he served throughout the 1850s and 1860s, two of the most tumultuous decades in American history. And so he's one of these individuals that we need to pay more attention to. But most people know nothing about James Bayard, and our forgotten conservatives in American history that Clyde Wilson and I authored together. I included a chapter on the Bayard family, not just James Bayard, but his father, James Bayard, and his son, Thomas Francis Bayard, because they as well are two very important individuals in American history who are often overlooked. Thomas Francis Bayard was a great defender of the South during Reconstruction and of the original Republic. And none of the Bayards owned slaves. They weren't proponents of slavery. What they were proponents of is the original Union and the original Federal Republic. They didn't want to see it destroyed by the Republicans. James Bayard actually called the Republicans reptiles, which is a great term for them. So it's a long speech, but well worth your time to read it, this Executive Usurpation. And so I'd highly recommend it. There's so many good things in it. We just don't have time to go through the whole thing. The next piece was actually a rerun. We ran this piece when we first launched the website way back in 2014, and so I thought it was important to put this up again, rerun it again, but it actually appeared at LouRockwell.com in 2002, and so we ran it here. But it's an article about Tom DiLorenzo and his critics by Clyde Wilson, and it's less about DiLorenzo than it is about the different critiques that are being leveled against DiLorenzo's work by the Straussians and the Jaffaites and these other people who are saying that basically they have the eternal truth, that DiLorenzo was a heretic in our American religion. And so that's when you look at Weaver, what he said in 1958, and what he said about Lincoln, how his use of language, and essentially this is exactly what the Straussians are doing with Lincoln too. It's the use of language. It's making Lincoln to be a saint. His use of language was so important because it elevates Lincoln to the status of a demigod in America. And the Jaffaites, the Straussians, would say, well, the issue is settled. And so anyone that opposes Lincoln is opposing the entire fabric of American history. Well, what Clyde is pointing out in this particular piece is that history is not that. History is not something that's settled. It can't ever be. Clyde says, quote, "No serious historian of the war between the states pays much attention to Jaffa or his works. The prevailing interpretation now, which has changed before and will change again, is that Lincoln carried out a revolution, not a salvation, a refounding, not a preservation. One may like or dislike the revolution, but there it is." He also says, "Historians are by definition aware that historical knowledge is never complete and conclusive, that there is always more to be found out, and always more than one way to look at things. I've always thought that the most important aspect of history was that it can teach us to see that there is usually more than one side of a question, that sweeping claims to final truth are deceptive, that moral judgments should be made after, not before, examining the evidence. Thus we are made better, more savvy, and less credulous citizens. This is such an important piece because it gets to the idea that our side needs to be listened to. And he talks about secession, and he talks about an interesting book that came out by Professor Tibor Macon in his Lincoln, Secession, and Slavery. And he says that, look, secession should be seriously considered, but we had hostages in the South, so you can never have secession where you have hostages. And Clyde points out that what about the 488,000 free black people in the United States? How can they be hostages when they were forbidden from entering northern states? Where are they hostages really? So Clyde's position in this piece is not necessarily to defend the real Lincoln, which he does very well, but it's to defend the idea that you can have dissent. And that's important. We need dissent in our understanding of history. We need dissent. Because without it, you can have no clear knowledge. And of course, what we get, and this is when I took a writing seminar in graduate school with Mark Smith, he pointed out, Reconstruction, as the interpretations of Reconstruction have gone on from the early 20th century to the present, what you get is less and less dissent, more and more narrow focus on what Reconstruction was. It's because historians are by nature sycophants. And they're not boat rockers. They all say to me, well, I'm going to come up with a new theory that no one's ever thought about before in this history, but it always piggybacks on something else that's already been written because they want jobs. And if you become too controversial, you don't get a job unless it's controversial on their side, which is the left. Now, if you come out and say, look, what we need is what Reconstruction needed was a real communist revolution, that would have been great. Well, you're going to get a chaired position somewhere. Hence, Eric Foner. But if you come out and say, you know what, the Reconstruction was a disaster. Oh, well, no, you can't say that. You can't say that at all because the consensus does not agree with you in that. So it's not really about coming out with a position that really looks at the material, interprets it through the material. It's looking at it the way you want to look at it and then using the material to prove your own position. And that's not history. That's a polemic. That's a legal defense of your position. So this particular essay is very good because it goes into this. Clyde takes out some of De Lorenzo's opponents and destroys the idea that there's only one side to this, that everything's been settled. Our Thursday piece was by Emmy Bradford, and it's a chapter from his book, Remembering Who We Are, Observations of a Southern Conservative, which is now out of print. It's very expensive usually to find a copy of it. But he gets into the point, this is actually one of the essays that caused Bradford some problems with the neoconservatives, and he had written other things about Lincoln too, and this is why his candidacy was withdrawn from the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, because he was against Lincoln, and rightfully so. But he starts discussing why Lincoln is so important. He gets into all the arguments made against Lincoln, whether it's his views on race and how Lincoln was, he's held up as this great hero for black Americans, yet his views on race would not be accepted by modern society. He gets into the point of, Lincoln destroying the Constitution and destroying the executive branch. But what he says is so important about Lincoln is not all of that. It's the way that he used language. It's the way he used language. And Bradford says, but in my opinion, the capstone of this case against Lincoln as an American model, this bill of particulars, contra the Lincoln myth, is not the patricide of his refounding, his conversion of the national government to our juggernaut, which we are all more familiar than we would like. Rather, his overall worst is what he has done to the language of American political discourse that makes it so difficult for us to reverse the ill effects of trends he set in motion with his executive fiat. When I say that Lincoln was our first Puritan president, I am chiefly referring to a distinction of style, to his habit of wrapping up his policy in the idiom of Holy Scripture, concealing within the Trojan horse his moral superiority, an agenda that would never have been approved or presented in any other form. It is this rhetoric in particular, a rhetoric confirmed in its authority by his martyrdom, that is enshrined in the iconography of the Lincoln myth, preserved against examination by monuments such as the Lincoln Memorial, where his oversized likeness is elevated above us like that of a deified Roman emperor, or in the form of a godlike or god king seated on his throne. So that's the Lincoln problem. It's the way that he used language. Everything that he did, everything that he said was wrapped like it was Holy Scripture. This is the Straussians. This is what Clyde was just saying in the previous piece, and this is what Weaver was saying in 1958. It's the way that Lincoln was able to use language that made him so effective and so powerful. I mean, the Gettysburg Address is a worthless speech, and the content of it, it's awful. But in the language of it, it's beautiful. Which is why people focus on that and say, my gosh, this is it. Here we have Scripture. This is American Scripture. Pauline Maier called the Declaration of Independence American Scripture. But maybe it's more the Gettysburg Address, it's American Scripture, not the Declaration. Because the Declaration has problems if you're trying to say this is a document that people focus on that second paragraph, but it's really the last paragraph of the Declaration that outlines American Scripture, and that is that there were free and independent states. But the Straussians focus on the second paragraph, which Lincoln then attached to the war through the Gettysburg Address. And so Lincoln was so good at language. This is why when you go to Washington D.C., you go to Lincoln Memorial, it's like bending a knee at the American God, Abraham Lincoln. It's transforming America from a federal republic where Washington was the great hero to a national unitary state with Lincoln as the great hero. It's the going to Lincolnian America. It's a transition from Washington's America to Lincoln's America. And that's the important thing about Lincoln. It's not the policies necessarily, which, again, are bad. It's not destroying the Constitution, which was awful, which Bayard pointed out, which, this is what's happening here. But, again, it was going to have a long-lasting effect. Bayard didn't even get to this point. Bayard called Lincoln an ordinary Western man. His opinion of Lincoln was not what we're talking about here, that Lincoln was just ordinary. There was nothing special about Lincoln. And in his opinion, it was Congress that was pushing the agenda more than Lincoln. But what Weaver and the Straussians and Bradford are pointing out is that they're using Lincoln in a way that, even at the time, was never. Lincoln's speech, if you go back to the Gettysburg Address in 1863, if you look at newspaper accounts of the speech, it's not even mentioned. It was Everett's speech before that was widely printed. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was an afterthought. It was just picked up later on by people to say, wow, this is such a great speech. It's really funny how that happened. No one thought much of Lincoln as a man, as a great speaker, as anything but an ordinary Western man, until later, until his assassination, until we needed Lincoln to create this nationalist myth in American history, which is the title of the next piece, our Friday piece. That's when Lincoln became important. That's when Lincoln became the man of the hour, the man who had transformed America. And it was not by policy necessarily. It was by rhetoric. It was by language. And that language is going to lead to a different type of America. And so on Friday, I wrote a little review of 3 books. The first is, all 3 of these actually are by 2 are by amateur historians, what you would call an amateur historian. One is a collection of essays by a philosophy professor, so not a historian, but the first is Dave Benner's Compact of the Republic, the second is James Ronald Kennedy's Uncle Seth Fought the Yankees, and the third is Jack Kerwick's The American Offensive. And I highly recommend you buy all three of these books. They're very good. But the reason I put them in here in Lincoln's Week is because what we're seeing, or what we saw with Lincoln, was a shift from a federal republic to a national government. And this creates a nationalist myth in American history. Lincolnian nationalism is built on a myth that we had one people, one nation. And all three of these books point out this is not the case. Well, Kerwick's book is more an indictment of this particular, it's an indictment of the symptoms of this problem. The first two, Compact of the Republic and Uncle Seth Fought the Yankees, get into this idea that we never had a one people. Benner's book is a thorough dismantling of the nationalist myth in American history through the compact fact of the Constitution. That's what he gets into. It's about this compact between states. Uncle Seth Fought the Yankees is actually it's an entertaining book. It's one of the Kennedys' first forays into historical fiction, but he has this character Seth who's trying to explain to his progeny what the war was really about. It's 107 little stories. And it's, the old man telling his future generations, this is what you need to know about the war. And the real problem was Yankee lies. And so anyone who's read the Kennedys know that they're just great at doing this. And so it's not, The South Was Right, of course, is great. Most people have read that in some of their other works. This particular book is a little different. It's not necessarily like Bill Arp, but it's kind of that homespun tale like you would have in a Bill Arp book about the war and what it really was. It's much more straightforward than Bill Arp, but definitely the tales are there to talk about what the South really was fighting for. And then Kerwick's American Offensive is, again, it's the symptoms of this one-size-fits-all policies from our general government. And Kerwick's a very good writer. These are essays he had published other places and put them into a book form. And they were written for a popular audience. So that's what Professor Kerwick has spent much of his time doing, trying to reach a popular audience and trying to change opinions. And this way, Kerwick is very important because oftentimes we don't try to reach a popular audience. We try to reach an academic audience, and the academics are never going to change. And so this is what the Institute is trying to do. We're trying to reach a much more popular audience and get people to go out and push this idea of what the South was and why it's important. It's Southern apologetics. And I conclude this little piece by saying that all three books prove that the real myth in America is not the lost cause, but Lincolnian nationalism. And this is true. The lost cause is not a myth. People call it the myth of the lost cause. There's that Bone Kemper book, about the myth of the lost cause just came out, about how it's all just, Southerners are just making stuff up. No. Northerners have been making stuff up. Lincoln was making stuff up. Not Southerners. Southerners were following the American tradition and seeking independence. And so when we have political correctness ruining America, it's just a symptom of the larger disorder, and that is nationalism, that we're all one people. Political correctness would say that, well, no, we're trying to have diversity here. No, not really. It's going back to language. It's going back to what Lincoln was doing. It's going back to what Clyde said. There's no diversity. There's no diversity for our side. It's diversity for their side. But their side really isn't diverse. It's their one way or no way. That's not diversity. And Lincoln was part and parcel of that. Nationalism. One people. One idea. That's all you can have. No toleration for dissent. No toleration for another side. And so the Pandoras Box was opened, as Bayard pointed out, and it can never be closed. Whether it's executive power, whether it's the view of the war, whether it's a view of American history, Lincoln's view is sacrosanct. Lincoln's view is the only thing that people are allowed to tolerate. That's it. And so you have the Straussians and the Jaffites and people that run around saying, well, it's all settled. It's been settled. There's nothing else to it. This is a myth of the lost cause. Really, the myth is their side. It hasn't been settled. And so our side needs to do more of this kind of work to get out there in the popular audience and say, this is the point. It's not settled. This myth, this nationalist myth is so pervasive. It's not settled. And we need to call them out for what they are. The treasury of virtue, the nationalist myth, these things that they present, which are just not true. Or at least there's another side to it that they don't like to talk about. So that's what we're doing here at the Abbeville Institute. It's why things like this podcast are important. It's why things like the articles we present on the website are important. Because without these things, their side just wins. And they know it. Which is why they work so hard to try to discredit everything we say. But if we continue to attack the nationalist myth, if we continue to expose Lincoln, and again, I was surprised that I was allowed to keep the chapter on Lincoln in the book, 9 Presidents Who Screwed Up America, because he is such a revered figure. But the reception about that chapter has been actually very good, even among people I didn't think would be good. But people are saying, yeah, this is true. Lincoln was problematic with the Constitution. He was. People know that. And I make a statement, it's saying that you have to destroy the Constitution to save the Union is like saying you have to cheat on your spouse to save the marriage. It just doesn't work. And so we need to think about that. I think that's a very funny way to present this whole idea. And if we can do that effectively, if we can continue to do this effectively, I think that our side can actually win the argument. It's going to be a long battle. But I think our side has all the ammunition. Our side has history on it, where their side doesn't. It's a creation of Abraham Lincoln. And even in Bayard's speech, I didn't point this out, but James Wilson, one of the most ardent nationalists of the founding period, says that you can never have one government over so large extent of a territory. He pointed this out. Even James Wilson said this. But why do we continue to push this idea? Why? Because of Lincolnian nationalism, because of the nationalist myth, because of people like the Straussians and Jaffa, because of Lincoln himself. And so this is why Lincoln is a transitionary figure, why Lincoln becomes the lightning rod, and why everyone has to defend Lincoln if you believe in American nationalism. And this is why we do what we do at the Abbeville Institute. So until next time, good day.